Imagine standing in the neon-soaked lobby of a Las Vegas hotel, surrounded by thousands of curious believers. The ear hums with anticipation as noted UFO researcher Stan Hernandez navigates the crowded convention floor. Amidst the flashing lights and strange theories, one man moves through the crowd with singular, somber purpose. He's a long-haul trucker, a man who has spent his entire life traversing the open road. His name is Scott Murray, and he carries a grief so heavy it seems to stop the room. Scott approaches Stan like a desperate sailor seeking a steady lighthouse in the middle of a storm. What could be so terrifying that a man would travel across the country just to tell a stranger? Stan looks into the eyes of the trucker and recognizes the haunted gaze of someone truly broken. Scott begins to speak, his voice trembling as he recounts the recent loss of his wife, Elizabeth. Is there any pain worse than losing someone you love to something you cannot even begin to explain? Elizabeth Murray's disappearance was not a typical tragedy, but a harrowing descent into the unknown and unexplained. The story Scott reveals is one of high strangeness, centered on a terrifying claim of alien abduction. He describes the horrifying details of her final days, mentioning the presence of mysterious and severe radiation burns. Stan Hernandez listens intently, realizing this encounter will become the focal point of a new, darker investigation. The researcher has seen many things, but the trucker's raw emotion suggests a reality far more disturbing. Within the sterile environment of the hotel, the shadow of Elizabeth's fate begins to loom over them. Scott presents his account as a desperate plea for answers that the conventional world refused to provide. This interaction marks the beginning of what would eventually be known as a landmark case in ufology. The Ringside Report would soon document the chilling events that left a man widowed and a researcher obsessed. Every word Scott whispers adds another layer of mystery to the tragedy of his beloved wife, Elizabeth. But to understand why this trucker sought out Stan Hernandez, we must look at the phenomenon's long history. The encounter in Las Vegas was merely the first step into a dark corridor of secrets and loss. The story Scott Murray was about to tell was the latest chapter in a terrifying legacy. Since 1961, the world has laughed at stories of silver craft and black-eyed entities, calling them mere hallucinations. But when the stories match a template established decades ago, the laughter starts to slowly fade away. The modern era of alien abduction began on a lonely, darkened road during a late-night car journey. In 1961, a middle-aged couple found themselves targeted by something far beyond their limited human understanding. They reported being taken away against their will, snatched from the safety of their vehicle into the unknown. This single, terrifying event created a haunting blueprint that thousands of others would eventually follow and describe. Why do thousands of strangers, separated by decades, describe the exact same entities with such chilling precision? Is it a shared delusion? Or are we witnessing a shared reality that science refuses to acknowledge? These accounts frequently describe small, unsettling creatures that possess unnervingly huge and deep black eyes. For over 60 years, these witnesses have faced mainstream ridicule, their harrowing stories dismissed as mere fantasy. Yet, the 1961 report became a blueprint for a nightmare that continues to manifest in our modern world. The consistency of these reports suggests a pattern that cannot be ignored by anyone seeking the truth. These strange entities often go unheard because the world is too afraid to listen to their message. Public laughter serves as a shield against the crushing weight of a reality we are not prepared for. But for those who have seen the huge black eyes, the ridicule feels like a second violation. Scott Murray's sister, Elizabeth Murray, would eventually become part of this dark and growing historical record. Her case might even be documented in something as detailed as the Ringside Report for historical preservation. From unexplained radiation burns to missing time, the details of these encounters remain disturbingly and hauntingly consistent. For Stan Hernandez, these weren't just stories. They were the reason for his entire existence. To understand the darkness Stan Hernandez lived in, we must travel back to a different era. Long before the modern UFO convention, a chilling blueprint for the unknown began to take shape. In 1961, the night sky held secrets that few people at the time dared to voice. A middle-aged couple found themselves driving through the quiet isolation of a late-night car journey. They expected a routine trip, but the shadows along the road had much more sinister plans. Suddenly, the peace of their drive was shattered by an encounter that defied all logical explanation. This couple reported being taken away against their will, stolen from the safety of their car. Their terrifying ordeal would eventually become a cornerstone of the modern alien abduction phenomenon. Within their strange account, a recurring nightmare began to manifest in the minds of the public. They described beings that would soon haunt the collective subconscious of countless witnesses worldwide. These were the first whispers of a specific template that investigators would encounter for decades. Alien abduction stories frequently describe these entities as small creatures with hauntingly distinct features. Their most unsettling trait is often the presence of huge, black eyes that reflect nothing back. This disturbing description has become a universal constant in the files of the Ringside Report. For Stan Hernandez, this 1961 case provided the historical weight needed to validate newer claims. He saw the same chilling details mirrored in the modern accounts shared by Elizabeth Murray. The small creatures with obsidian eyes weren't just fabrications. They were a consistent, terrifying reality. Every detail of that late-night abduction served to strengthen the bridge between the past and present. It established a terrifying precedent that would follow Scott Murray throughout his own difficult journey. The historical record was beginning to reveal a pattern that no skeptic could easily dismiss. Stan Hernandez knew that these historical echoes were the only way to prove the impossible. He meticulously archived every report of radiation burns and sightings to build a cohesive timeline. The 1961 incident remained the gold standard for every investigation that followed in its wake. It was the dark foundation upon which the entire narrative of Elizabeth Murray was built. Now, the true nature of the small creatures was about to be revealed once again. At 85 years old, while others look back, Stan Hernandez continues to gaze intently at the distant stars. He is a man driven by a single, obsessive mission that has defined his entire professional life. What keeps a person searching for a truth that the rest of the world has long rejected? Is he a noble crusader for hidden knowledge, or simply a man chasing elusive ghosts in the night? Stan is like a tireless detective investigating a cold case that everyone else has already ruled as suicide. This noted UFO researcher has dedicated his career to uncovering the mysteries of the great beyond. Now in his mid-80s, Hernandez remains a persistent figure in the ongoing search for extraterrestrial proof. To the world, he is just an aging reporter for a dedicated online investigative group. But to the silent victims of unexplained phenomena, Stan Hernandez represents their very last glimmer of hope. He makes his living by reaching out to those who claim to have survived an alien abduction. Many of these individuals carry physical scars, including strange radiation burns that defy any conventional explanation. He listens to stories like those of Scott Murray, whose life was shattered by Elizabeth Murray's disappearance. In the bustling halls of a UFO convention, Stan searches for the patterns that connect these accounts. As a reporter for the Ringside Report, he documents every shred of evidence he can possibly uncover. His sole objective has always been to provide undeniable proof that aliens and UFOs truly exist. For Stan, this is not just a hobby, but a lifelong pursuit of a reality hidden from view. He sifts through countless reports of radiation burns and metallic crafts, seeking one final piece of truth. Every interview conducted for the Ringside Report brings him one step closer to his ultimate, singular goal. He bridges the gap between the skeptical public and those who have looked into the visitor's eyes. Yet, Stan's absolute conviction was not born out of reading books or listening to mere hearsay. His unwavering belief was forged long ago in the heat of a desert night in 19... This formative experience transformed a young man into the dedicated researcher we see standing before us today. Stan Hernandez claims he doesn't just believe in Roswell because of the news or dusty books. He asserts he was there in person, wearing a uniform and witnessing the unthinkable firsthand. The secret Hernandez carried for over 60 long years remains the true foundation of his credibility. It all began in the sweltering heat of 1947 during the infamous Roswell UFO incident. At that time, a young Stan Hernandez served as a member of the U.S. Army personnel. He was stationed deep within New Mexico, right at the epicenter of the world's greatest mystery. The desert air held a tension that few could understand unless they walked those restricted grounds. As a soldier, his duty was clear, but the sights he encountered defied every military protocol. He saw things that left permanent scars, perhaps even more dangerous than physical radiation burns. Immediately following the event, Hernandez alleges he received strict orders to remain absolutely silent. Superiors commanded him to never speak a word about his time at the Roswell crash site. For decades, he buried the truth beneath a heavy layer of disciplined and professional military silence. What happens to a secret when it is kept hidden for over 60 long years? His forced silence acted as a heavy vault that only the passage of time could unlock. This military background provides a chilling weight to the stories he shares at the UFO convention. Listeners lean in close, sensing the gravity of a man who stood where history was made. Being part of the U.S. Army personnel gave him access that ordinary civilians never possessed. The 1947 Roswell incident was not just a news story to him, but a lived reality. He lived under the shadow of a command that demanded his absolute and permanent secrecy. His formidable resume made him the perfect person to lead the investigation for the Ringside Report. Understanding the tragedy of Elizabeth Murray required someone who had already seen the impossible. With a resume like that, Scott Murray knew he had found the right man to hear the story. On January 15, 2013, during a bustling Las Vegas convention, Scott Murray waited for the cameras to turn off. This weekend-long event had drawn believers from across the globe to discuss the mysteries of the unknown universe. The air in the hotel lobby was thick with speculation, but Scott had something painfully real to share. Stan Hernandez had just finished his role as a guest speaker, finally stepping away from the bright podium. At 48 years old, Scott Murray stood in the shadows, his hands trembling with a secret he couldn't keep. He had spent most of his adult life as a long-haul trucker, accustomed to long nights and lonely roads. Stan was currently occupied, speaking quietly with fellow researcher Russell Tetro near the center of the lobby. Scott moved through the crowd like a man carrying a bomb he desperately needed someone to help defuse. Why did he wait until the lobby was nearly empty to ask for a different kind of help? He watched as the other attendees drifted away, leaving the veteran investigator vulnerable to his approach. When the conversation with Russell finally ended, Scott stepped forward into the path of the famous The noise of the convention faded into the background as Scott prepared to speak his wife's name aloud. He didn't want a signature or a casual handshake. He sought an audience for a true tragedy. The story he carried involved Elizabeth Murray and a terrifying series of events that defy conventional explanation. Is there a specific fear that only comes out when the lights of the world finally go down? He spoke of radiation burns and alien abduction, terms that Stan Hernandez knew well from years of study. The veteran researcher saw the genuine desperation in the eyes of the trucker and agreed to listen privately. Their hushed conversation in that hotel lobby would soon lead to one of the most credible cases ever documented. The glitz of the city stood in sharp contrast to the dark, harrowing tale Scott was desperate to tell. What Scott told Stan that day takes us away from Vegas and into the quiet isolation of rural Michigan. The story Elizabeth told her husband was every couple's worst nightmare, beginning in the isolated Michigan countryside. It started with a phone call while Scott was driving along a dark, lonely stretch of highway. Scott heard Elizabeth's voice trembling through the line, heavy with a fear he had never heard before. She spoke of a terrifying void, an unexplained hole in her life that nothing could ever fill. Just hours earlier, Elizabeth had been standing in their quiet backyard, surrounded by the shadows of evening. Suddenly, the world vanished into a sudden, deep blackout that stole her consciousness without any warning. Time became a fractured memory as she slipped into a dark silence that lasted for several hours. When Elizabeth finally opened her eyes, she was lying on the cold grass, confused and utterly alone. The familiar sights of her home now felt alien, transformed by a trauma she could not explain. As she stood up, a sickening realization washed over her, chilling her to the very bone. Elizabeth felt a profound sense of violation, believing she had been drugged by an unknown intruder. The terrifying physical sensations suggested she had been sexually assaulted during those lost, silent hours. How do you react when the person you love most shares a truth that seems completely impossible? Panicked and breathless, she struggled to find the words to describe the nightmare she had just endured. Through the phone, she whispered a sentence that would change their lives and haunt them forever. "I know this sounds crazy," she told Scott, her voice barely audible over the static. Then came the admission that defied all logic. She believed her attackers were not of this world. She was certain that aliens had taken her, echoing the terrifying template of the 1961 abduction case. Where do you go when you have been violated by something that officially should not even exist? Scott listened in stunned silence, caught between protective instinct and the sheer impossibility of her claim. This was no ordinary crime, but a descent into a darkness that left no physical fingerprints. They needed answers, yet the truth remained hidden within the gaps of her fractured, missing memory. Elizabeth sought help at a local hospital, desperate to find proof of the horror she had survived. But when doctors performed their examination, they found something that did not fit any human crime. The evidence they uncovered would soon draw the attention of investigators like the legendary Stan Hernandez. While the medical report remained empty, the physical evidence in the backyard was impossible to ignore. At the emergency room, Examiners found no physical signs of sexual assault on Elizabeth Murray. Despite the lack of criminal evidence, the doctors discovered a strange burn on Elizabeth's right shoulder. This marking was only the beginning of a mystery that would soon consume Scott Murray's life. Returning home, Scott began to inspect the grounds of their isolated Michigan property for answers. Their house sat in deep seclusion, located more than 2 miles away from the nearest neighbor. Scott stood alone in the silence of the countryside, surrounded by an increasingly unsettling atmosphere. In this quiet isolation, Scott discovered a series of marks that defied any rational explanation. Pressed into the grass were 4 large, identical circular burn marks that formed a geometric pattern. These burns were like a signature left on the earth itself by an unknown, powerful force. The precision of the circles suggested they were created by something mechanical rather than natural. Moving toward the perimeter of the yard, Scott noticed further damage to the wooden fence. A small, localized burn mark had scorched a single fence board as if by a laser. This single scorched board suggested a focused intensity that no common household tool could produce. These ground-level scars told only half the story of what had visited the Murray property. Scott looked upward and saw something even more disturbing hanging high above the scorched grass. Thick clusters of blackened leaves clung to the trees, nearly 20 feet above the cold ground. What kind of intense heat could char foliage at that height without burning the entire tree? The pattern of destruction suggested that an immense, scorching object had hovered directly over the yard. The blackened foliage looked as though it had been blasted by an invisible, overhead exhaust. Every leaf and blade of grass pointed toward an encounter that was both silent and violent. Could a human hoaxer truly create such precise damage in a yard miles from any witness? While the scorched earth was chilling, Elizabeth carried a haunting physical reminder of her own experience. These unexplained radiation burns would eventually draw the attention of investigators, like the legendary Stan Hernandez. The physical evidence of an alien abduction was mounting, far beyond what any skeptic could dismiss. The scorched earth in the backyard only told half of Elizabeth Murray's harrowing story. Driven by fear, the couple sought answers within the sterile white walls of an emergency room. Doctors performed a standard examination to search for signs of physical trauma or violent assault. Despite the terrifying nature of the encounter, the initial medical results came back surprisingly clean. Examiners explicitly confirmed that Elizabeth showed no physical evidence of any sexual assault occurring. This lack of typical violence made the entire event feel even more clinical and bizarre. However, a closer inspection of her body soon revealed a mark that defied explanation. High on her right shoulder, medical examiners discovered a peculiar and highly localized burn. This strange injury appeared fresh, yet it lacked the characteristics of a common domestic burn. The skin bore the silent signature of something far more technological than a mere accident. It sat there as a physical anchor to a memory that felt like a nightmare. For Scott Murray, seeing the odd mark on his wife's shoulder confirmed his worst fears. This wasn't just a mental trauma, it was a physical wounding from an unknown source. The sterile hospital light made the radiation burn stand out with a haunting, reddish intensity. While the rest of her body remained untouched, this singular mark told a different story. It was a precise, deliberate brand that suggested an interaction far beyond human understanding. The medical staff could offer no biological reason for how such a burn could occur. In the quiet of the examination room, the mystery of the Michigan incident grew deeper. Every scientific test failed to explain why Elizabeth had been marked in this specific way. This physical evidence would eventually lead the couple to Stan Hernandez in a UFO convention. Details of the injury would later be documented in the files of the Ringside Report. In a desperate search for answers, the Murrays turned to a door they could never truly close. The truth did not set Elizabeth free. Instead, it began to break her very spirit and mind. Under the gentle guidance of a hypnotist, the memories of Michigan finally began to flood back. What was once a silent blackout transformed into a vivid, terrifying landscape of the unknown and alien. Elizabeth described being pulled from her reality and taken deep inside a massive, metallic craft. She spoke of strange entities surrounding her, their presence chilling her to the very core of her soul. These beings were not of this world, operating with a cold, clinical indifference that defied human understanding. Every detail she recalled under hypnosis painted a portrait of a nightmare she could never escape. The massive object she remembered was a vessel of profound power and unsettling, otherworldly mystery. As the session continued, The weight of these recovered memories started to crush her fragile psychological state. Recalling the alien abduction was like opening a wound that would never again find its way to healing. The trauma of the encounter was now fully realized, casting a long shadow over her daily existence. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth drifted into a catatonic state, lost within the halls of her mind. The woman Scott loved was slipping away, replaced by a hollow shell, consumed by lingering, cosmic fear. Is some knowledge simply too heavy for the human mind to carry without breaking under the pressure? Elizabeth became a prisoner of her own memories, haunted by the cold touches of those strange entities. Scott watched helplessly as his wife's sanity eroded, searching for any way to provide her with security. He believed that physical protection might ease the psychological terror that had taken root in their home. In a tragic effort to offer her peace, Scott Murray provided Elizabeth with a handgun for some. He hoped the cold steel of the weapon would act as a shield against the unseen intruders. The handgun was meant to be a tool of empowerment, a way to reclaim her stolen sense of safety. Instead, the weapon became a dark focal point in a house already brimming with despair and trauma. When he handed her that gun, Scott never imagined it would be used against the person he loved. The silence of their living room was soon shattered by a tragedy that would haunt him forever. Elizabeth Murray was eventually found lifeless on the floor, the weight of her experiences finally proving too much. A single gunshot wound to the head had ended her suffering, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions. The mystery of her abduction had claimed its final, most devastating toll on the Murray family's life. Her death was a grim conclusion to a story that began in the isolated fields of Michigan. The file on Elizabeth Murray would eventually find its way into the records of the Ringside Report. Scott Murray didn't just lose his wife. He lost her to a mystery that would consume him entirely. Scott needed proof to make sense of the carnage left behind in his scorched backyard. After the funeral, his grief turned into a desperate, focused hunt for scientific validation. He carefully collected the blackened blades of grass from the mysterious ring in his lawn. These scorched remnants were the only physical links to the night Elizabeth was taken. Scott reached out to a nearby college, hoping a professional could explain the damage. The identity of this specific institution remains a secret even decades after the event. A head researcher there initially offered Scott the breakthrough he was so desperately seeking. The scientist reported finding trace amounts of radiation lingering within the organic grass samples. For a moment, Scott felt the vindication of a man who finally had tangible proof. The presence of radiation suggested an event far beyond any normal atmospheric phenomenon. But the scientific proof began to feel like cold sand slipping through his fingers. When he returned for the formal results, the atmosphere at the laboratory had shifted. Researchers suddenly claimed there were no conclusive signs of radiation found in the grass. How does a trace amount of radiation simply disappear from a scientific report? Scott wondered if it was a genuine mistake or if someone was leaning on the lab. The retraction left his investigation at a devastating and suspiciously quiet dead end. Without the lab's support, his claims of an alien abduction sounded like mere fantasy. The physical evidence was still there, yet the official record had been wiped clean. With the science labs turning their backs, Scott turned to the only person who would listen. He prepared his story for the Ringside Report, seeking counsel from the legendary Stan Hernandez. Hernandez was a fixture at every UFO convention, a man who believed the impossible was real. If Scott was looking for a savior in Stan Hernandez, he may have found a ghost instead. But here's where the story takes a turn you won't see coming for the Murray family. The man Scott trusted to tell Elizabeth's story was actually hiding dark secrets of his own. Investigating Stan's professional background reveals a digital trail that feels like a house of cards. When researchers looked closer at Stan's credentials, the foundation of his authority began to crumble. Stan Hernandez frequently claims to be a dedicated reporter for an outlet called the Ringside Report. This name suggests a hard-hitting investigative agency, but the reality is far more confusing for followers. Deep searches reveal that the Ringside Report is actually a defunct online publication for the boxing world. Why would a prominent UFO researcher host his findings on a site meant for prize fighting? The connection between alien abduction and retired boxers remains a bizarre and unexplained mystery. This strange digital home for his research immediately raises red flags about his journalistic standards. It seems Stan's primary platform is nothing more than a graveyard of broken links in sports news. However, the peculiar choice of a boxing website was only the beginning of the troubling discoveries. Within the scattered research folders on Stan's site, investigators found something much more disturbing. Amidst the claims of radiation, burns, and lights, photos of unidentified individuals appeared in his reports. These portraits were not witnesses or victims of the Michigan incident, as one might have assumed. Horrifyingly, several individuals in these photos have been identified as known and registered sex offenders. Their presence alongside Elizabeth Murray's sensitive case files creates a chilling and deeply uncomfortable atmosphere. Are these photos the result of absolute negligence or something far more sinister within his research? Scott Murray had no idea that his wife's trauma was being archived alongside such predatory faces. When confronted with these glaring issues, Stan Hernandez offers a defense that is equally bizarre. Stan claims his website is regularly targeted and hacked by government authorities to destroy his reputation. He insists that shadowy agents plant disinformation and disturbing images to discredit his alien abduction findings. This narrative of persecution serves as a convenient shield against any scrutiny of his professional credibility. For Stan, the presence of sex offenders is simply another layer of a massive government cover-up. Whether it is a hack or incompetence, the damage to the Murray case is already catastrophic. Scott's last hope for a serious investigation was now tied to a very questionable source. The line between a dedicated truth seeker and a deceptive storyteller has become dangerously blurred. Stan claims his site is hacked, but the truth might be even stranger than he admits. As the facade of the expert begins to crack, the Murrays are left more alone than ever. Elizabeth Murray was not the only person to seek sanctuary within Stan Hernandez's shadowy archives. A pattern was emerging, and it was a lethal one that had claimed lives long before. Just months before Scott met Stan in Vegas, another man named Book Stabler walked this path. The archives revealed a story that mirrored Elizabeth's, beginning decades earlier in the chill of autumn. In October 1988, Book Stabler reportedly became a victim of a terrifying and life-altering alien abduction. 4 years, Stabler carried the heavy weight of his experiences, searching for someone who would listen. His claims were met with harsh ridicule, casting him into a deep well of social isolation. Like the Murrays, Stabler eventually found his way to the doorstep of the Ringside Report's creator. In September 2012, Stan Hernandez finally sat down to record the long-awaited interview with Book Stabler. The veteran researcher documented every detail of the 1988 encounter with his usual clinical detachment. Stabler hoped that sharing his truth with an expert would finally grant him some sense of peace. However, Stan's files often resemble a graveyard for those who have seen more than they can bear. Instead of finding a savior, Stabler found himself further entangled in a web of public mockery. The stigma of the abduction proved to be a burden too great for one man to carry. By December 2012, only 3 months after his interview with Stan, the pressure reached a breaking point. In a tragic final act, Book Stabler committed suicide, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. Is it the experience of the abduction that kills, or the cold isolation that follows it? Two separate lives were now linked by the same researcher and the same unbelievable, haunting claims. Why did both Elizabeth and Book find their way to Stan Hernandez right before the end? The connection suggests a dark phenomenon where the truth becomes as deadly as the encounter itself. Stan's recordings are no longer just historical documents. They are echoes from a very real abyss. As the facade of the expert cracks, we must wonder what these victims truly saw. To understand the shadow hanging over Stan Hernandez, we must examine the tragic case of Book Stabler. Like Elizabeth Murray, Stabler was a man haunted by a past he could never fully escape. His journey into the unknown began decades ago, during a fateful autumn night in the late 80s. In October 1988, Book Stabler reportedly experienced a terrifying encounter that changed the course of his life. He claimed to be a victim of alien abduction, a memory that would slowly fester for 24 years. For over 2 decades, Stabler carried the heavy weight of his trauma while searching for someone to believe. Eventually, his search for validation led him directly to the doorstep of the legendary researcher, Stan Hernandez. In September 2012, Stabler finally sat down with Hernandez to provide an official interview regarding his experiences. They met just as the seasons began to turn, unaware of the darkness that was quickly closing in. The Ringside Report archives grew larger as Stabler poured out every harrowing detail of his 1988 encounter. Hernandez documented the testimony, adding another witness to his vast and growing collection of extraordinary claims. However, the relief Stabler sought through sharing his story proved to be fleeting and tragically short. Just weeks after his extensive interview with Hernandez, the situation took a sudden and devastating turn. In December 2012, the community was shocked to learn that Book Stabler had tragically committed suicide. Only 3 months had passed since he shared his deepest secrets with the man he trusted for help. This timeline creates a chilling pattern that investigators find difficult to ignore when looking at Hernandez's work. The proximity of his death to the interview raises uncomfortable questions about the cost of seeking the truth. Stabler's story ended in darkness, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a growing sense of dread. We are left to wonder if revisiting the trauma of 1988 pushed him over the edge of sanity, or perhaps something even more sinister was revealed during those quiet hours spent in Hernandez's private study. The patterns are becoming impossible to ignore as we dig deeper into these forgotten and dusty archives. 5 years have passed since Elizabeth Murray's life ended, yet her story remains shrouded in a thick, unsettling silence. The lush green grass in that Michigan backyard has long since reclaimed the soil where the radiation burns once glowed. Time has a cruel way of erasing physical proof, leaving only the hollow echoes of a terrifying midnight encounter. For Scott Murray, the passage of these 5 years has brought no peace, only a growing mountain of unanswered questions. The case has drifted into the realm of local legend, a ghost story whispered in the halls of a UFO convention. Without verifiable names or precise dates, the haunting details of Elizabeth's abduction feel like a fading, tragic dream. Stan Hernandez holds his archives tight, but the lack of physical samples makes his grand claims feel increasingly weightless. We are left searching for a truth that seems to dissolve the moment we try to grasp its cold edges. Every lead in the Ringside Report eventually hits a dead end, lost in a labyrinth of anecdotal evidence and shadows. Is this a masterful cover-up by unseen forces, or merely a myth born from one woman's unexplained trauma? How do you verify a tragedy that left no witnesses except for a victim who can no longer speak? The missing physical evidence acts like a void, drawing us in while offering absolutely nothing tangible to hold on to. Scott Murray continues to pace his quiet home, haunted by the memory of a wife the world has started forgetting. The scorched earth is gone, replaced by the mundane reality of a world that refuses to acknowledge the impossible. In the absence of data, the story becomes a Rorschach test for those desperate to believe in the extraordinary. 5 years later, we are no closer to the truth than we were the night the lights first appeared. The case of Elizabeth Murray remains a ghost, visible to the brokenhearted but impossible for science to truly touch. Investigators look for footprints in the dust, but the wind of time has swept the Michigan countryside clean. Every missing date and every unnamed witness serves as a reminder of how easily the truth can be buried. The mystery of Elizabeth Murray doesn't end with a definitive answer. It ends with a difficult and lonely choice. In the end, this isn't a story about aliens. It is about a man who lost everything. Somewhere out there, Scott Murray is still driving, navigating the quiet stretches of the American highway. We can only hope that in the solitude of his cab, he has found the peace he seeks. For years, the memory of Elizabeth Murray has been a heavy passenger on every long-haul journey he takes. He remains the keeper of a flickering flame that no one else in this world can truly see. In a world obsessed with cold proof, is a husband's unwavering love the only thing that is real? Scott carries the weight of a story that the official reports and medical files simply could not hold. He sought answers in the neon glow of a UFO convention, hoping for a shred of validation. Stan Hernandez offered him a glimpse into a shadowy archive, but the truth remained just out of reach. The Ringside Report documented the radiation burns, yet the mystery of their origins stayed locked in the dark. Alien abduction is a phenomenon that remains nearly impossible to either prove or fully disprove in our time. Scott Murray doesn't need a laboratory to confirm the terror his wife faced in that Michigan backyard. What would you do if the person you loved most claimed they were hunted by something otherworldly? Would you stand by them when the world turned away, or would you let the silence consume you? Scott chose to believe, turning his grief into a quiet mission to honor Elizabeth's haunting final days. He travels through the night, a witness to a truth that defies the boundaries of our known reality. The scars on the land have faded, but the impact on Scott's soul remains as vivid as ever. He found no salvation in the archives of Stan Hernandez, only echoes of others who suffered similarly. Every mile he drives is a tribute to a woman whose life was changed by a terrifying light. The evidence may be vanishing, but the human connection to the unknown remains a powerful, unyielding force. Perhaps the answers Scott found weren't written in files, but in the simple act of never forgetting. As the stars watch over the highway, one man continues his search for a peace that surpasses understanding. Elizabeth Murray's story survives not in the headlines, but in the heart of the man who knew her. In the silence of the Michigan countryside, the mystery lingers, waiting for the next witness to arrive. For Scott Murray, the journey doesn't end with a solution. but with the courage to keep moving forward.